Dear colleagues, hello. My name is Livia Puljak. I come from Croatia, and I will talk about some ideas how to avoid redundancy in systematic reviews. So first, let me start with some definitions. So what is a systematic review? And there is no consensus definition. A few years ago, I studied this question with my colleagues, and we analyzed multiple sources and how systematic review is defined by those sources. And we found some different and vague definitions of what is a systematic review, and that these definitions are often using unclear terminology, such as clear, explicit, and systematic without further elaboration. So when addressing anything related to systematic reviews, in this case, redundancy, we should first ask what is a systematic review. So this is one aspect that we can certainly improve in the field of research methodology, is to come up with a consensus definition of what is a systematic review, and then only consider these questions in reports that are truly adhering to this consensus definition of a systematic review. Then there is a question, what is redundancy? Because there are also some ambiguities about that in the literature relating to systematic reviews. So I checked the Cambridge Dictionary, and redundancy is defined either as a situation in which someone loses their job because they're not longer needed, or what is relevant for our talk today, a situation in which something is unnecessary because it is more than is needed. So in our case, redundancy in systematic review would mean more systematic reviews than are actually needed. When we go through literature and information available, then we can see that this redundancy is mentioned in multiple aspects. So for example, there is a guide for ethical writing that addresses duplicate and redundant publication. So in this respect, the author says that duplicate publications are publications containing identical or nearly identical text, but redundant publications would be when researchers publish the same data, but with a somewhat different textual slant, which would be a version of a duplicate publication. So when we talk about redundant systematic reviews, it is difficult to skip the paper published by John Ioannidis in 2016, which was titled The Mass Production of Redundant, Misleading, and Conflicted Systematic Reviews and Meta-Analysis. And in this paper, Ioannidis wrote that most topics addressed by meta-analysis of randomized trials have overlapping redundant meta-analysis. Some topic with meta-analysis may have exceeded the number of 20. So in this case, for example, you can see that the terms overlapping and redundant are used as synonymous. And the question is this really a synonym, and can we treat it as such? A figure from this paper has a term that says redundant and unnecessary. So if we have redundant and unnecessary, the question is redundancy always unnecessary? Then we also have a 2013 paper published by David Moore, in which he wrote that not all duplication is bad, and that some replication is needed and also essential, because, for example, if we have results that cannot be replicated, then this is bad for science, because, and you're already aware of the replication crisis. So the Moore also wrote that in the context of systematic reviews and meta-analysis, there is no magic number of what should be considered the correct amount of replication. And so his proposal that most people would probably consider that if you have 2 or 3 systematic reviews on the same topic with similar eligibility criteria and outcomes, that this could be reasonable, whereas 4 or more would definitely be too many. And there's also a very relevant question posed by Moore: when does replication become unnecessary duplication? And he also highlighted that unnecessary duplication should be considered research waste, which is a problem also from the funding perspective. Then in 2020, Peter Tagel and colleagues published a consensus checklist that guides authors through replication of systematic reviews. The guide is asking when to replicate systematic reviews of interventions. And in this paper, the group has acknowledged that terminology and conceptual framework for replication were not standardized, and they proposed two types of replication. So one would be a direct replication, which would be defined as purposefully repeating to verify the findings of the original research question, and conceptual replication. So this conceptual replication would be different than the direct replication in terms of on purpose broadening or narrowing the research question in existing systematic reviews. For example, defining a broader or more focused populations, intervention type settings, outcomes, or study designs. Recently, David Pieper and I have argued in a commentary published in Journal of Clinical Epidemiology that the problem with conceptual replication with this definition is that when authors investigate the same research question, but they use modified methods or modify the research question, it is not realistic to expect true replication. And then there is a question whether this conceptual replication should be considered replication at all. And in that case, it is realistic to expect to produce overlapping systematic reviews, but not replicated or duplicated systematic reviews from the ones that already exist. We also pointed out to the problem of intentionality, of whether somebody intended actually to replicate something that already exists. Because something that we will define as redundant or overlapping or duplicate, maybe people did not do it intentionally. Maybe they did not do it on purpose. Maybe they were simply not aware that there is a systematic review which is the same or very similar to theirs. For example, maybe they did not search literature, or they did not search it adequately, or they did not analyze registries such as Prospera. And I would also like to highlight again, in addition to what Moore wrote, that there is some value in redundancy, because in research, it is important to recognize that some redundancy is good and it should be considered a feature of the system and not the bug. But then we are coming back to the Moore's question of how many redundancy is acceptable. So what would be the potential solutions for too much of the same? Some solutions that I would like to propose are solutions that could be imposed on multiple levels. So for example, there are some gatekeepers actions that could be imposed. So as you are all aware, in 2005, International Committee of Medical Journal Editors decided that clinical trials need to be registered prospectively. So for example, maybe journal editors as gatekeepers can also impose mandatory registration of systematic reviews. It is currently considered a good practice, and it is included, for example, in methodological expectations, in checklists of methodological quality of systematic reviews, but this is not mandatory. Also, another action that could be done by gatekeepers is to simply reject systematic reviews that are recognized as clearly duplicate, redundant, or unnecessary. Then, secondly, I recognize the need for further methodological research in this field. So, for example, modifying existing checklists to include a justification for new systematic reviews, developing methods for evidence-based research monitoring, which is done within this cost action. And then also defining conclusiveness. This means to define what does it mean that a systematic review is conclusive and that we do not need further research in this field of any kind. And also, I think we need interventions that will help all of us, all of the stakeholders in the research ecosystem, that would help all of us to adopt the existing methodological advances. And last but not least, I think we need education of researchers. So let's go through some of these ideas. So for example, mandatory registration of systematic review protocols. If we impose this, and if there is indeed mandatory registration, so the next question would be where to register, because there are multiple registries that authors can use. We don't have a single registry. So even if one goes to a registry such as Prospero, maybe this individual searching for registered systematic reviews would not find all the protocols that there are available out there. Because even though Prospero is most widely known currently, it has its own challenges. I have published a letter some time ago in which I wrote about delays in publishing systematic reviews registration in Prospero, and I described my case of a systematic review that waited 6 months from submission to publication on the Prospero website. And within these 6 months, we almost completed this systematic review because it was very narrow and we didn't have many included studies. So this means that if somebody was looking for a systematic review protocol on our topic, they would not be able to find it during those 6 months that we have waited to register it publicly in the Prospero website. Then we have citation analysis. So if we require that somebody is doing a search for systematic reviews and that they cite the existing systematic reviews, even that may not be enough, because maybe when somebody started their systematic review, maybe there wasn't a duplicate or overlapping systematic review, but somebody maybe was faster than them and something got published along the time when the other group was working on their systematic review. Because to make sure that nobody has conducted a systematic review such as yours, in theory, you should continuously search the literature to find if maybe somebody has registered or published something like you have in the meantime. And we have already addressed citation analysis as a method for EBR monitoring in this cost action. So citation analysis is defined as an examination of the frequency, patterns, and graphs of citation. And we have published a systematic review recently. This was published this year in the Journal of Clinical Epidemiology. We found 27 studies that have used citation analysis. And what we found is that these studies have approached this method of citation analysis in different ways. And these studies, it appeared that they have defined their outcomes in different arbitrary ways. And that we need future work on consensus methods about how to monitor the EBR and how to do citation analysis. Another point which needs to be further discussed in the research field is how to define what is a conclusive systematic review, meaning when do we have enough or sufficient data that we no longer need primary research or new secondary research, new systematic reviews. But we simply don't know because there is no consensus and there is not much work in this field. Even when something is declared as conclusive, it is often not clear why. So we have tackled this question recently in 2 papers that were published in research synthesis methods. So in the first paper, we addressed reviews that Cochrane has declared as stabilized. For Cochrane, stable systematic review is the one that is not in the need of updating. So in the first study, we included more than 500 Cochrane reviews labeled as stable in Archie. And we found that the most common reason for stabilization was that the last search did not identify any potentially relevant studies that are likely to change conclusions. And for almost half of the Cochrane reviews, we found, we considered that the justification that was provided by Cochrane for stabilization was not clearly described. It was not sufficiently informative to make to conclude why was this actually stabilized. Then, since we found in this first study some Cochrane reviews which were stabilized with a justification that they were conclusive, we wanted to analyze those systematic reviews from Cochrane in more detail, because we were wondering, what does it actually mean that a systematic review is conclusive? We were wondering whether Cochrane has any algorithm, any recognizable method, any recognizable pattern of data that would warrant a conclusion that something was conclusive. So what we found after analyzing 40 Cochrane reviews is that the rationales for their stabilization did not enable any insight into the Cochrane's decision-making algorithm for considering the evidence as conclusive. We also analyzed the outcomes presented in the summary of findings table, and we found that the great majority of those outcomes were rated at either low or very low certainty of evidence. And we were very concerned about this because it appears that Cochrane is deciding that some systematic reviews are providing conclusive evidence based on evidence that are mostly of low or very low certainty. And what we found when we analyzed those reviews is that none of those reviews mentioned in the text that the review should be stabilized or closed, or that there is sufficient evidence on this subject. So from this, we can only conclude that the authors themselves did not decide that these reviews should be stabilized or closed because they are conclusive, because otherwise they would write this in their systematic review and in their conclusions. So, so it is possible that this decision for stabilizing or closing these Cochrane reviews because they are conclusive was done by somebody in Cochrane, which does not include Cochrane review authors. So we concluded that the definition of systematic review conclusiveness is still lacking, which may contribute to research waste. So what is needed is methodologists working on these topics. So there are multiple aspects of this problem that require further work. A lot of them is about definitions. How do we define all the things that we are working on and that we would like to address so that we all know what we are talking about and that we are all on the same page. So even when some definitions or taxonomies are proposed, they should be open to further debate because it is questionable if a single group of researchers proposes some definitions, whether this is universally adopted or approved by other researchers in the field. So I would like to show an example from a recent manuscript published by Carol Looney and colleagues about a new taxonomy for overlap across overviews of systematic reviews. So in this example, the group defined overlap as duplication of PICO eligibility criteria and not reported as an update nor a replication. So now the question is, if somebody does not report that something is an update, if somebody does not report that this is a replication, should this be indeed considered as an overlap? And then if you see in the second bullet, in this paper, the authors defined multiple categories of overlap. So they had overlap that was identical, nearly identical, partial, or subsumed. So when you would look into their methods, the question is whether everybody would agree on their definitions about overlap and how to set thresholds about what is identical, nearly identical, partial, or subsumed, and what is not desirable in further research. So I also think that we should explore interventions about how to adopt the tools or knowledge that already exist, because we already have some good practices and we have some tools and checklists that could be used. And we all know the multiple studies are showing that these practices are not adopted or are insufficiently adopted. So the question is, how do we improve that? So we don't only need development of new methods, we also need to work on interventions about how to adopt the existing method to a sufficient amount. So as we said in our recent meeting in Bratislava from the COST Embrace, there's a lot of hard work ahead for colleagues working in the field of research methodology, and everybody working in this field, will have plenty of topics to address in future. But I think that we should also be realistic because there are so many researchers and so many journals. And it is difficult to expect that everyone will be aware of the expectations, and even if they are aware that they will adhere to them. There will always be research waste, and and we are all aware that there are journals with insufficiently inadequate research practices and that accept systematic reviews of inadequate quality. So if they are accepting systematic reviews of inadequate quality, they will also accept those that we can consider as redundant, duplicate, or unnecessary, or those with inadequate amount of overlap. But we should not be pessimistic about it. We can certainly try to do our best to reduce it in the future. Thank you.